The hum of the engines filled the cabin like a steady heartbeat, lulling most passengers into calm. In the aisle seat near row 12, a woman with braided hair rested against the window, lost in the deep sleep that comes after long travel. Nobody paid her any attention. She looked like any ordinary traveler escaping the noise of the world at 30,000 feet. Then the captain's voice cracked over the intercom, tense, urgent, and strangely uncertain. He asked a question that sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Was there any fighter pilot on board? Passengers exchanged startled glances. Flight attendants stiffened. And still, the woman by the window slept on, unaware that her quiet presence would soon become the center of everything. The flight from Dallas to New York had started like any other. Business travelers buried themselves in spreadsheets. Parents calmed restless children with snacks and cartoons. College students scrolled endlessly on their phones. Among them sat 32-year-old Alicia Grant, a black woman who preferred window seats so she could close her eyes and drift into her own world. The last few years had left her exhausted, both by the demands of her work and by the constant sense of being judged wherever she went. On airplanes, she kept to herself, aware of the subtle stares that sometimes lingered too long when she walked down the aisle. She had not intended to fall asleep so soon after takeoff. Yet as the cabin lights dimmed and the white noise of flight settled in, her fatigue won. Head tilted against the window, she seemed utterly detached from the unfolding scene around her. What no one on that flight knew was that Alicia had once been among the first black women to fly combat aircraft for her country. She had left the military quietly after years of service, retreating to a quieter civilian life. The uniform, the call sign, the grueling sorties, all of it felt like a distant chapter she rarely spoke of, partly because of the barriers she had faced there. In the cockpit, the captain was receiving updates from air traffic control about a severe storm system ahead. Turbulence was expected, but that wasn't what rattled him. A technical indicator had begun to flash on the control panel, a possible hydraulic malfunction in one of the control surfaces. It wasn't critical yet, but if it worsened, landing the plane could become dangerously difficult. Following protocol, he prepared the passengers for possible turbulence. Yet as he studied the erratic readings, a thought gnawed at him. If the situation deteriorated, he might need someone on board with advanced piloting experience, someone who could assist or take over in an emergency. The odds of finding such a person among the passengers were slim. And yet, as a seasoned pilot responsible for hundreds of lives, he had to ask. The captain's announcement cut through the relative calm of the cabin. The words were plain, but the tremor in his voice magnified their weight. It was not the kind of announcement passengers were accustomed to hearing. People sat up straighter. The hum of whispered questions swelled. A man in a suit glanced at his wife, who instinctively gripped his hand. A flight attendant near the galley exchanged a sharp look with a colleague, both of them silently acknowledging that something unusual was happening. Racial dynamics, as subtle as they often were, flickered beneath the surface of that moment. Some passengers instinctively looked toward the front rows, as if expecting a confident, uniformed presence to rise and volunteer. Their eyes slid past Alicia, slumped against her window seat in a casual hoodie, as though someone who looked like her couldn't possibly be the answer to such a call. The flight attendants crept through the aisle, scanning faces, asking in low voices whether anyone had military flight experience. Passengers shook their heads, murmured apologies, or averted their gaze. Tension crept through the confined cabin space like static. The turbulence worsened. Overhead, bins rattled. A drink cart nearly tipped before a crew member steadied it. Still asleep, Alicia shifted slightly but didn't wake. 2 rows behind her, a middle-aged man muttered under his breath that the captain should just focus on flying the plane. A young woman next to him whispered that there must be someone on board. With the skills needed, fear fed speculation. At the cockpit door, one of the senior flight attendants knocked lightly and leaned in to receive updates. Her face was drawn tight when she returned. The captain's concern was growing. The hydraulic issue was spreading to secondary systems, making a challenging landing increasingly likely. The attendant began to make discreet inquiries seat by seat, this time with greater urgency. A former small-plane hobbyist raised his hand tentatively, but admitted he had never flown anything larger than a two-seater. The look on the attendant's face as she moved on told everyone nearby how unhelpful that was. Through all of this, Alicia remained oblivious. For years, she had trained herself to fall asleep quickly on flights, a skill learned from countless redeployments. The rhythm of flight was familiar, even comforting. In her sleep, she was far from the anxieties of the present moment, but eventually the murmurs grew loud enough to stir her. She opened her eyes groggily, caught the tail end of a whispered question from the aisle, and frowned. She noticed the strained faces of the crew, the stiffness in the passengers' postures, the subtle dread in the air. It was not the first time she had sensed that dread. During her years of service, she had sat in briefing rooms where her competence was doubted due to her gender or the color of her skin. She had flown missions in hostile skies, only to hear later that some still questioned whether she belonged in the cockpit at all. Now, sitting there in civilian clothes, she could feel the unspoken assumptions around her, that someone like her, sleeping quietly in coach, could not possibly be the person the captain was hoping for. As the turbulence jolted the cabin again, a flight attendant steadied herself by Alicia's seat and asked the RAW if they had heard the announcement. Alicia nodded slowly. A faint, almost wry expression crossed her face. She hadn't yet revealed her past, and years of being underestimated had taught her to choose her moments carefully. But as the attendant moved on and the storm outside grew closer, she realized that this might soon become one of those moments when staying silent would no longer be an option. The storm hit with a sharp, disorienting drop that made several passengers gasp. The plane rocked, seatbelt signs chimed, and the cabin crew clung to seatbacks to keep their balance. The captain's voice returned, firmer now but still tinged with strain, explaining that they were diverting to a nearer airport for safety. The decision made sense, but the mention of manual assistance in certain procedures unsettled the more attentive passengers. Alicia exhaled slowly, as if letting go of years of reluctance. She unbuckled just enough to flag down the nearest attendant, who hurried to her side. Quietly, she explained that she had logged thousands of flight hours in military aircraft, including emergency procedures in combat zones. The attendant's eyes widened. Surprise first, then relief. She nodded quickly and disappeared toward the cockpit. Moments later, another crew member came to escort Alicia forward. Heads turned as she made her way down the aisle. Some passengers looked curious, others incredulous, and a few carried that subtle flicker of recognition that they had assumed wrongly about her. In the cockpit, the captain's composure softened when she introduced herself and summarized her background in clipped professional terms. There was no need for bravado. Her confidence was clear in her concise explanation of the relevant systems and procedures. The hydraulic failure had limited one of the control surfaces, making the approach and landing more complex. The captain briefed her quickly, and together they reviewed the manual procedures to compensate for the error. While the storm outside buffeted the aircraft, they worked in a quiet, coordinated effort. The crew relayed instructions, the co-pilot adjusted to her presence, and Alicia focused entirely on the task at hand. In the cabin, passengers felt each shift of the plane as it descended through turbulence. Fear was etched in the furrowed brows and clasped hands of strangers sharing a collective uncertainty. Then, amid the heavy rain and crosswinds, the plane touched down. It wasn't the smoothest landing, but it was controlled, deliberate, and safe. Applause broke out almost reflexively, a release of the tension that had gripped everyone for the past hour. Back in the cabin, as Alicia returned to her seat, she caught a few lingering stares. Some were grateful, while others carried a sense of awe. And beneath that, perhaps, a silent reckoning with their earlier assumptions. The flight rolled to a stop at the emergency-cleared runway. Fire trucks stood ready but unused, their lights flashing in the rain. Passengers disembarked more quietly than usual, many pausing to thank the crew and casting curious glances at the woman who had slipped back into her seat without fanfare. Alicia moved with calm efficiency, helping an elderly passenger retrieve her bag from the overhead bin. She responded with a few hushed words of thanks, accompanied by a slight nod and a polite smile. She had no desire for the spotlight. She had lived too long in environments where recognition came late, or not at all. Later, as news of the incident trickled into local reports, much was made of the unexpected heroism of a passenger with military experience. Few stories captured the quieter, subtler truth that for much of her career, Alicia had been asked to prove herself again and again in ways her peers were not. On that flight,